What's up, everyone? Welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast that takes a trip down Philly sports memory lane and asks the question, what if? I'm your host, Jim Montgomery. Welcome to episode 33. It is NFL free agency. It's also March Madness. If you follow the daily podcast this day in Philly sports history, you know there are no Philly teams. And I'll be honest, as I'm recording this, it's Thursday afternoon. 2 games into the tournament, 0-2 on my bracket. So we're off to a phenomenal start. But real quick, this day in Philly sports history is every day on YouTube as well as anywhere you get your podcasts. This is Back to the Future, the weekly, more in-depth podcast. So be sure to check out both of them and give them a like and a subscribe wherever you get your podcast. But as I mentioned, NFL free agency period has started. I've been trying to hold off as long as possible on this to see where the pieces fall for the Eagles, but it's been a very interesting, to say the least, free agency period. They re-signed Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, James Bradbury, Boston Scott, Rashard Penny they signed, and that's pretty much about it as far as the signings. Oh, Jason Kelsey's back, but they've lost a few players, and nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that was unexpected. The big story today was Darius Slay, who was going to leave, and now all of a sudden he's coming back. I haven't heard any details about that, and that's why I was trying to hold off. I wanted to see if there was an update on C.J. Gardner-Johnson, who, I mean, if they can somehow bring back Darius Slay and C.J. Gardner-Johnson with the moves they had, I'm perfectly fine with that, because basically what it does then is puts the pressure on Howie to do well in the draft. And I think it's important. He wants to do that. I think we're all well aware that if he doesn't, the way it's set up, it's going to explode and explode in his face and not work. So we'll see. No updates and no movement. I think it's a game of chicken between the owners as far as extending these quarterbacks. Nobody has really signed yet. And I think somebody's waiting for somebody else to make the first move. I would love it for it to be Howie and do it, kind of set the bar and let everybody go over that. But we'll see. So with all that being said, it is free agency. It's one of the more entertaining aspects of the NFL offseason, because now everybody's posturing to get these players, and then you set yourself up for the draft then next April, or next month, which is April. So a brief history of free agency in the NFL, and I'm going to go through this a very high-level overview because there's a lot of legality stuff that I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. But from the beginning of the NFL until 1946, it was basically what was known as the reserve rule, and there was zero free agency. Basically, teams could re-sign their players until they didn't want them anymore or trade them to another team. So ultimately, you saw a lot of guys, especially early on, decide not to play for NFL teams and continue to just either play college or do other things. Happened to the Eagles' first ever draft. The guy they drafted said, I don't want to play for them, and he never played. And ultimately, he never played in the NFL. So basically, for lack of a better way to put it, the players were the property of the team. And then in 1947, the players started to complain somewhat about it. So they had what was known as the reserve clause, and it was a one-time thing they could use at the end of a player's contract. So ultimately, it was an option year. So players could say, I don't want to play anymore. It was their option year. They were opting out of their contracts. The owners could basically say, no, we got you for one more year. And then after that year, the players were ultimately able to negotiate with any team as a free agent. Nobody did it until 1962. And R.C. Owens was the guy that did it. He played a year with his option year last year with the Niners and then went to the Colts. So part of the reason nobody left is because it was different back then. Guys that were playing, they were very loyal. They lived in the city. A lot of times they had jobs in the offseason because the NFL was not this multi-billion-dollar corporation that it is now. So they felt some sense of loyalty to the area they lived in. And I know it's not necessarily football, but guys on the Flyers used to have jobs bartending down at the shore in the off season, things like that. Chuck Bednarik actually worked construction. So just different things like that. And it was different. So the fact that this guy was the first one to leave after almost 15 years, 20 years, 15 years, it said something about just where the state was. But after this, they instituted what was known as the Rozelle Rule. Now, why did they have to institute a new rule? Well, did you notice what team I said this guy left for, R.C. Owens? He played for the 49ers. And as we know, Eagles fans, we know what happened after the NFC Championship game. Apparently, it's in their DNA in San Francisco, at least for the 49ers, to just be whiny little bitches. So, the owner of the 49ers, Vic Morabito, complained. Again, shocker. But he said it wasn't fair, this, that, and the other, only because it was the first time. I mean, everything that happened was within the rules. So he said the commissioner should be able to award us compensation. This guy left, and now we don't get anything for it. Wah. Our quarterback hurt his shoulder. Anyway. And basically, he said we need to get something, but the two teams had to agree. So ultimately, what it did was the teams had to work out whether it was players, money, picks, and ultimately, or I'm sorry, not the owners. The commissioner decided what the compensation would be. So, for example, if C.J. Gardner-Johnson doesn't come back to the Eagles, basically the commissioner could get to choose, all right, whoever he signs with. Let's, for the sake of argument, let's say he signs with the 49ers. 49ers owe the Eagles their fourth-round draft pick and $4 million or something. And whatever the commissioner said was final. And again, it sounds like a little bit of a bitch move here on the 49ers owner. It's like if your team was better and the guy wanted to play for you, maybe you but anyway. But then people fought it, the players and everything, and it actually went to court. And this is where I don't want to get too far bogged down with, but Mackey versus the NFL said it actually hurts the players because teams would be less likely to sign a guy because they would have to pay compensation for it. And it's like, well, no, I didn't want to trade for you. I just want to sign you off the street, and now I have to give up a draft pick or money or a player because the 49ers owner, Vic Morabito, whined like a little bitch. So ultimately, what it led to was, this was in 1977. Basically, because of Mackey, the CBA changed, and it was known as the right of first refusal in compensation. So basically, the teams had a chance to match a contract, or they would receive draft pick compensation if the player left. So basically, Gardner-Johnson goes to sign with the 49ers. Eagles have a chance to match it. If not, they get something in return. But it wasn't like a draft pick from that team, because like if you think about it now, the way the NFL does it, they give draft picks at the end of the round for guys that leave. So, and then they had this big chart basically that here's what the draft pick compensation was based on what they made and what their experience was. It was tweaked somewhat after the 82 strike, but that's how it was good like that for about 11 years or so. And then in 1989, they decided to start attempting some type of free agency. So this was Plan B free agency. And this is basically what I remember when I started watching. And ultimately, every year, the team could protect 37 players of its 47-man roster. Rosters were much smaller back then. And the players that were protected technically that were not under contract could be signed by another team, but the same compensation chart applied. The unprotected players were free to go wherever. And so the Eagles were actually, I remember back in those days, Buddy Ryan was good at picking players off a Plan B free agency. The only time a protected player changed teams was Wilbur Marshall, who went to the Bears to Washington. Everything was fine, but like the players were still not 100% happy. So they took it to court, and in September of 1992, four players sued the league, went to court to try to get their free agency. And this is kind of the first signs of our modern day system that we have. The four players, including tight end Keith Jackson, which we mentioned if you go back on our Buddy Ryan episode, I go into a little bit of detail about this. Basically, the judge ruled in favor of the players and gave a temporary restraining order where those four players were able to sign. Keith Jackson immediately signed with the Dolphins. The fact that this led to further court cases led to the modern day free agency, which started in 1993. Basically, the way it is today, with some minor tweaks, including the salary cap and things like that. Reggie White was the first big free agent splash. He obviously went to a small market, which kind of really hurt the owner's argument that the big market teams were going to get all the good players. So the fact that he went to Green Bay, whether or not, thinking about it now as a kid, I was devastated. But now thinking about it, I don't know if there was some pressure on Reggie to maybe go to a team like the Packers, who were on the up and up then. So it wasn't like, oh, you're going to a shitty team in a small market. But I don't know if there was some pressure like, hey, maybe you ought to go here. But ultimately, so that's how we got to where we are today. So throughout the history of modern free agency, I'm not going to go back to Plan B and everything. The Eagles have had some very, very good free agent classes, and they've had some very, very shitty ones too. Obviously, like I said, they were heavily involved in the early days of modern free agency, with Keith Jackson hating Norman Bremen that much that he sat out and decided to take it to court to get his free agency. The Reggie White thing, it still stings to me this day. Broke my heart. Like, I've never gotten over Norman Bremen being such an asshole. Whether or not it was him, whether there was pressure, listen. Reggie said he wanted to stay. Bremen said he offered him a contract, and Reggie turned it down. Reggie's widow says, no, it's not true. Reggie never got offered a contract by Norman Bremen. So who knows what the truth is, but that today still stings and like upsets me to no end. But ultimately, this is what kind of led. So the Eagles were definitely very much involved in the early days of the free agency as we know it in the NFL. So I thought, what better way than to celebrate with a list? We're going to go the list of the best free agents as well as the worst free agents in the Eagles' history. And honestly, I made this list. I think for the most part, you all would probably agree with the guys on the list, just maybe the order. But I did it based on their stats, but also the impact they had on the team at the time. So there might be guys that you look back at now and say, wow, they had a great career and the Eagles got them cheap, this, that. But I looked at it more on their impact on the team. So without further ado, let's go into the list. But before we do, I had to start off with a guy who just in a special category of his own for a variety of reasons. And he was a free agent signing, but not really, because the Eagles had to trade for him, even though he should have been a free agent. And I think you could put him number one on both of these lists, and that is Terrell Owens. And ultimately, he should have been, when the Eagles signed him in 2004, he should have been a free agent, but his agent missed the deadline and didn't fax that he intended to be a free agent, even though T.O. was in the media saying, I'm going to be a free agent. So there was a miscommunication. He said he wanted out. Everybody knew it. So the 49ers, once again, the 49ers, what a shitty run organization. Yeah, I know they got 5 Super Bowl titles, whatever. But it's funny that they're always the ones whining. So they wanted something for T.O. T.O. didn't want to be there. And I guess he was switching agents. This is before Drew Rosenhaus, and somehow they missed a deadline, which is stupid. I mean, everybody knew he was gone, but I guess at the time the rules were the rules. And even though T.O. was very vocal in saying, I want to go to Philadelphia, the 49ers were like, no, we're gonna trade. And they traded him to Baltimore. So Baltimore really is the one that got the short end of this stick. So ultimately, it goes down, I guess, in the books as a trade, even though he was not under contract and the Eagles had to negotiate that contract with him. So that's why he's a special category. But I say he could be number one on both the best and the worst list because obviously once he came in, put them over the top, took them to the Super Bowl, and then a year later completely tore apart the team. So, I mean, again, he could be on both lists. I didn't put him on either one because technically, by the letter of the law, it was a trade. But to me, he was a free agent signing. But like I said, he could be number one on both lists. I could make the argument either way. But let's start then with the 5 worst. So honorable mentions, and these are in no particular order, was Demetrius Bell, offensive tackle in 2012, Steve Wallace, another offensive tackle in 1996, Steve Smith, wide receiver in 2011, Vince Young, quarterback in 2011, and you might be surprised to hear this one, Javon Curse, defensive end in 2004. Basically, he was not the player he was in Tennessee when he got to Philly. So let's start with number 5, the of the worst free agents the Eagles have ever signed. We're going to come in with safety Blaine Bishop in 2002 from the Titans. And we kind of should have known that something was up because nobody was signing him. He was hurt the year before. In his prime, he would have been a great safety pairing with Brian Dawkins. And he got old very fast when he came to Philadelphia. And if you need any sort of proof of that, go back and look at the replay of the Joe Jurevicius catch in the NFC Championship game in 2002. Jurevicius just completely outran him. No need to do it. And ultimately, I think what happened, Andy Reid went after the name recognition. He knew the Eagles were close. They had drafted Michael Lewis, who was supposed to be the next big safety. So I think Blaine Bishop was only supposed to be a stopgap until they got to Michael Lewis, but ultimately he ended up playing a big role in costing the Eagles that NFC Championship game. So that's why we got him in at number 5. All right, number 4. Going to stay in the secondary. This one could make the argument that without this guy, the Eagles don't win the Super Bowl in 2017, but Byron Maxwell in 2015 from the Seahawks. That was Chip in his 2015 season. You're going to hear a couple more from him. But they signed him to a 6-year, $63 million contract. And he came into camp, and all the reports in camp were just how terrible he was playing in camp and the fact that he didn't care. Like, he had zero qualms about sucking so bad. And I think what happened, he was riding the coattails of the Legion of Boom. And we come to find out he wasn't that good on the Legion of Boom. Everybody else elevated him and made him better. Somehow, I don't know how, Howie worked some magic and traded him and Kiko Alonso and the 13th pick for the 8th pick in the 2016 draft, which ultimately they parlayed into the 2nd pick. They got Carson Wentz, which helped them win the Super Bowl. So you could say without Byron Maxwell, the Eagles don't win the Super Bowl. Still, our number 4 worst free agent signing of all time. And I think the funniest thing was going back, and I read a tweet the other day. Somehow it came up. And basically after the trade, or they announced the trade, and he was injured, shocker, and it held up the trade for a little bit, which could have completely changed the fortunes of the Eagles. And somebody wrote, who knew? Finally, Byron Maxwell stopped something. But anyway, that's a little dad humor there. All right, number 3, we're going to go all the way back to 1993, the first year of real free agency. When Reggie walked, the Eagles needed a replacement. So who did they look to? Tim Harris, defensive end from the 49ers, who basically was expected to be Reggie White light, cheaper than Reggie White. He had 17 sacks a year before. So I remember he was played a big role on some of those 49ers teams. I mean, in 1993, he played 3 games, 6 tackles, and was gone the next year. And, I mean, that whole season was a complete mess. That was the 4-0 year when Randall broke his leg, Fred Barnett hurt his knee, and it just was a complete and total waste. I mean, Bremen tried to pull a fast one like, hey, Reggie didn't want to be here, but here's Tim Harris, who's just as good, and he wants to be here. No, he didn't. 3 games, 6 tackles. Boom. See you later. All right. Number 2, and I could not decide on which one to put here. Obviously, I know which player played worse, but I think these two are a package deal, and we talked about this on This Day in Philly Sports History the other day. The number 2 worst free agent signings, we're going to go back to 2015. I couldn't decide, so we're going to go DeMarco Murray and Ryan Matthews, who were announced at the same time. And basically, this is Chip's disastrous 2015 season when he finally got general manager power and just started getting rid of everybody. He traded away LaShawn McCoy and brought in both of these guys to replace Shady McCoy. He famously said, well, we allocated the money to running back, and now we got 2 good players instead of 1. Problem was, neither player were half as good as Shady combined. DeMarco signed a 5-year, $40 million contract. He had led the league in rushing the year before. He only averaged 3.6 yards in his 1 year, and I feel like every time you watch this guy run that year, it was boom, into the line, boom, tackled for a loss, boom. And I don't know whether the Cowboys knew something, that they used him too much or what, but it was just a disaster from the start. He was gone the next year. I don't know if they traded him or just who knows. But, of course, he goes to Tennessee and has 1,300 yards the next year. So, there you go. I feel like it was an inside job and we were set up to be ruined by a Cowboy. He was a Cowboy. I think he came in and did it on purpose, fucker. All right. And then Ryan Matthews was not terrible by himself. He was a good complimentary back. It got him on the cheap, pretty much 3 years, $11 million. I think he got caught up in the mess of 2005 because DeMarco Murray sucked so bad. I think that it made Matthews look worse than what he was. Like I said, I don't think he ever really played that good, even in San Diego. But I think for what he was a good complimentary back. The problem was you didn't have the stud workhorse that you would have had. Ryan Matthews would have been a good complimentary backup to Shady McCoy. Thanks a lot, Chip. All right, so there are number 2 worst free agent signings. We'll put these guys as a package deal: DeMarco Murray and Ryan Matthews. And the number 1 all-time worst free agent signing in Eagles history, 2011, Nnamdi Asomugha from the Raiders. And it's not even close. As bad as DeMarco Murray was as a free agent signing, Nnamdi Asomugha was worse. 5 years, $60 million. He was in his prime. He's coming off 3 straight All-Pro seasons, widely regarded as a shutdown corner, Darrelle Revis-like, and this is what we needed. Nope. He was none of that. Not only that, he was another one of those guys who just didn't care and didn't really put in the effort, had his mind on other things like Hollywood and outside projects and this and that, which is fine, but he just didn't care. And he was out of football 2 years later. And number 1 by a long shot, and it's not even close. Like, I can't stand to look at that guy every time I see him or hear his name. It just, it's like he's almost up there with Norman Bremen for me. It's like, he's got the most punchable face ever. I'm sure he's a nice guy, but he's got a punchable face. And all of these guys have one thing in common, at least here in the top 5. We all got them 2 to 3 years too late. It's kind of like the typical Phillies thing where they bring in like Greg Jeffries after he's washed up, or bring these big name guys in after. The Flyers used to do that a lot. Adam Oates at the end of his career. But those are my top 5 all-time worst free agent signings in Eagles history. And like I said, when they got it wrong, they got it wrong. But let's flip the script a little bit. When they got it right, They got it right. So let's start with the five best, or go to the five best. Honorable mentions in no particular order. This one is going to rub some people the wrong way, and I'm okay with that. Nick Foles. Nick Foles, I did not put in the top five for two very specific and I think big reasons. One, he was drafted by the Eagles, so he was here before, and I know that doesn't really matter in free agency. But two, he was signed as a backup quarterback, and I think the other five guys did. Sure, Nick Foles meant a lot to this team. That's why he's on one of the, to me, the best free agent signings. I don't think he's top five. William Fuller, defensive end from 1994. Good old Irving Fryer, wide receiver from 1996, who got in a little bit of trouble for mortgage schemes and things. And Nigel Bradham, linebacker in 2016. Again, another guy who, if we didn't have him, he played a big role in that Super Bowl run. And I still can't forget the whole Jim Schwartz comment when he got in trouble for whatever it was. I think it was a gun or something. He was like, well, if you dumbass things, people are going to start calling you a dumbass. And like, it was like the most matter-of-fact, accurate thing I've ever heard. Yeah, you do dumbass things, people are going to start thinking you're a dumbass. All right, but five best Eagles free agent signings of all time. Coming in at number five, I got Ricky Waters. And running back, 1995 from the 49ers. He's a somewhat local guy from Harrisburg. And take away the fact that the team was not necessarily that good. And listen to these numbers. And keep in mind, the Eagles didn't really have a good stud running back since Wilbert Montgomery at this point. So he comes in, he averages 1,700 yards of total offense. The only guys that averaged more were Barry Sanders and Terrell Davis. He was the only guy to have 1,000 rushing yards and 400 receiving yards all 3 seasons. He scored 32 touchdowns. Just an all-around, just stud player for the Eagles. They won the wild card in 1995. They lost the wild card in 1996. 97, they were just a hot mess with quarterbacks, and I think that's what really killed that team. I mean, you think about it. They had Irving Fryer, who was still a pretty solid receiver at that time. You had one of the best top 3 based on the numbers running backs in the game. But yeah, you were rolling out like Rodney Peete, Randall Cunningham, who, what is he in? Is he out? Who is it? Like Bobby Hoyne. Like guys like that were it was a mess. 100% hot mess. And on any other time, he would have been higher on this list. He gets pushed back up, or down the list, I should say, because of how shitty the team was at that time. And obviously, he didn't make the greatest first impression on the Eagles. First game, I don't even remember. I think it was late in the game. They were driving, whenever the play was, but they were playing the Buccaneers. I'll never forget. He was going over the middle, short arm to pass because he didn't want to get hit. And people asked about him in the meeting. He was like, for who? For what? One of the most famous lines in Eagles lore, and I think that still rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and I don't think he ever gets necessarily the love that he should. Granted, he was only here for 3 seasons, but I mean, there's 3 amazing seasons. So coming in at number 5, Ricky Waters. Number 4, guy that was kind of in a similar boat as Ricky Waters. We're going to go back to 2008. Asante Samuel, quarterback from the Patriots. He played here 4 seasons. And he was so good in 4 seasons here. He's top 10 all-time in the Eagles' history in interceptions. One of the knocks against him was he was not a tackler. And, I mean, I can still see him to this day throwing his shoulder, trying to make tackles. But he was a playmaker, and he played a huge role in that 2008 playoff run to the NFC Championship game when they lost to the Cardinals. They did make the playoffs 3 of the 4 seasons. He was a Pro Bowler 3 of his 4 seasons. And honestly, those teams were very, very disappointing. That's when Andy Reid probably made the right decision, got rid of Donovan, but we didn't really have anybody. That was like when he was rotating in and out of Kevin Kolb, Michael Vick, Nick Foles, Jeff Garcia. Like there was never like they all had like solid seasons and everything, and they just couldn't close the deal. I'm thinking back to that Packers game. There's a Saints game when Sheldon Brown almost decapitated Reggie Bush. They just couldn't get over that hump, and it's very disappointing. And I do think Asante Samuel's another one of those guys like Ricky Waters who doesn't get the recognition for being such a good player for the Eagles as he should, because the teams were so disappointing. But number 4, Asante Samuel. All right, number 3, we're going to stay in the backfield. Going to go to a hometown guy, local guy, 1996 cornerback Troy Vincent from the Dolphins. I always forget that he was a Pennsbury guy. So he born and raised in the area. Pretty much excelled when he got to the Eagles. 28 of his 47 career interceptions are with the Eagles. He really, really took off under Jim Johnson when Andy Reid and him came in. He made 5 straight Pro Bowls, and that secondary was just absolutely ridiculous. You had Vincent, Bobby Taylor, Brian Dawkins, and Al Harris. Like, stop. How did that team not win a Super Bowl? How? Tell me how. How can anybody pass on them? Seriously, how could anybody? Oh, that's right, because they had no linebacker play. Ugh. Thanks, Andy. But Troy Vincent made the 75th anniversary team for the Eagles. He was the Walter Payton Man of the Year in 2002. Only the second Eagle to do that at the time. Harold Carmichael was the first in 1980. Since then, Chris Long won it in 2018. He was unceremoniously kind of pushed out the door. If you remember that same draft that they got Michael Lewis, they drafted Sheldon Brown and Lito Shepherd. So unfortunately, Troy Vincent was very integral in building that Eagles defense up that ultimately got to the Super Bowl. He just never got to go to the Super Bowl. He did make out pretty well for himself. He's basically Roger Goodell's like right-hand man now. So, but number 3 on this list, local Pennsbury guy, Troy Vincent, as the Eagles' third best free agent signing of all time. Number 2, going to go to the big nasty guys. Jon Runyan, offensive tackle in 2000 from the Titans. He was here 2000 to 2008 and anchored the right side of that line. Trey Thomas, who was already here, anchored the left side. And ultimately, between Jon Runyan and Trey Thomas, they helped McNabb be McNabb. It was, to me, one of the golden era of Eagles football. Runyan's in the Eagles Hall of Fame. He's on the 75th anniversary team. In my opinion, he's borderline up there with should be having his number retired because of what he meant. He's one of the all-time best to ever play for the Eagles, and just one of those nasty guys. He always had the reputation of being somewhat dirty, and I think he thrived in that, and I think it kind of gave him a little bit of an edge. He always had that big rivalry with Michael Strahan, who, when Strahan retired and got in the Hall of Fame, he mentioned Jon Runyan. So it was always fun. And I've mentioned 1,000 times, and I'll probably mention 1,000 more times, just how much I hate the Giants, but I love that rivalry so much better than the Eagles-Cowboys rivalry. And the Strahan-Jon Runyan thing definitely played into that. He is a Michigan guy. I love my Michigan Wolverines. And the one thing I always remember is during introductions, number 69, Jon Runyan, and he always ran out with his arm straight up, and it just was so funny with his cast on his arm. So the number 2 all-time best free agent signing for the Eagles, Jon Runyan. All right, and number 1, to me, the best free agent signing of all time for the Eagles. And I was not a fan of this when it happened, and I'll explain why, but I'm glad I was wrong about this. Safety in 2014, Malcolm Jenkins from the Saints. Now, he was solid with the Saints. He was a starter. He won a title with them. But he became elite with the Eagles. He was here for 6 seasons, and he became elite. Now, I said I wasn't a big fan of it. Excuse me. Because if you go back to the 2014 offseason, the big favorite that everybody wanted as a safety was Jarius Byrd from Buffalo. And that's who we thought that we were signing. That's who we thought we were getting. Byrd ended up, we were one of the finalists for Byrd. Byrd ended up going to the Saints, which allowed the Saints to not have a need for Malcolm Jenkins, who then came to the Eagles. So it was almost like we settled for Jenkins. Well, from that moment on, 2014 until this day still, even though neither one of them were playing, I'd say Malcolm Jenkins had a slightly better career than Jarius Byrd. So I am 100% willing to admit when I'm wrong, and I'm glad I was wrong on this one. He was the leader of not only that defense, but that team. And he was one of the major reasons they won the Super Bowl. They don't win the Super Bowl without, and I know I say without this trade or that or this. Honestly, they do not win that Super Bowl without Malcolm Jenkins. He was the heart and soul of that team, leader of the defense. He's that hit on Cooks in the Super Bowl. People say it was dirty. You look at the replay; it was a clean hit. And everybody always says, like I said, they don't win the Super Bowl without Wentz, or they only won because they went after and brought in LeGarrette Blount, or they traded for Jay Ajayi or this. No, they don't win the Super Bowl without Malcolm Jenkins. I don't care what anybody says, and if you think differently, you're wrong. Don't even hit me up or anything. They don't win the Super Bowl. That's why, for me, he is the number one all-time best free agent signing. Never mind what else he did for the city. The whole fighting for equality and fighting for civil rights and just all of the programs and things he has in place in the city of Philadelphia. Forget about that. I'm just talking about on the field. That is why he is the number one all-time free agent signing in Eagles history. So I could be wrong, but I doubt it. Anyway, just kidding. So who did I miss? Should somebody have been on the list that I didn't mention? Should somebody from the honorable mentions be in the top 5? Did I completely skip over and miss somebody? Should I have put T.O. at both? Tell me what I got wrong. Honestly, unless you're going to tell me Malcolm Jenkins is not the number one, I'm kidding. Tell me if I'm wrong. But yeah, give me a comment on social media, comment on the podcast, YouTube, wherever. Let me know, because this is one of those things I think we could go on and have a great discussion about. So let me know, comment, tell me what I got wrong. Make sure you're listening every day to This Day in Philly Sports History. For the month of March, we've been doing Women's History Month Spotlight, much like we did Black History Month in February. I have some things lined up for April and May and stuff to help us get through the dog days of summer when it's just the Phillies. Make sure to like and subscribe to both. Follow me on social media, YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Jimbo_Mont, Instagram at Philly Jimbo. Send me a text message, smoke signal, whatever. Tell your friends. Tell one person that doesn't already listen to this podcast to listen. That's all I ask. And like I said, and if you're, tell your friends, tell your enemies' friends, tell your friends' enemies, tell your enemies' enemies. But that I guess would be your friends. And if you are, because I know we're big in the demographic of 4th through 6th graders. If you're a 4th through 6th grader girl listening right now in your dad's car, tell your friends' dads about the podcast, because I'm sure they have a big opinion on these free agent signings. So tell me about it. All right, it's March Madness. It's St. Patrick's Day tomorrow. Hopefully we're going to see C.J. Gardner-Johnson sign. Hopefully we get that Jalen Hurts extension, and then we can focus on the draft. Go have yourself a week. I'll see you next week. We're probably going to be doing our Phillies preview because it's that time of year and they start in March this year. Have yourselves a week, and until next time, I will see you when I see you.